Right, well, thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to share my screen and hopefully you can hear me and you can see that. I was explaining we are coming from 3 different parts of England, Margaret, Mandy and myself. We have awful weather here, so we're keeping everything crossed that our Wi-Fi is going to hold up for you. So we're talking about forgotten women, marginalised women, misfortunate female ancestors, and a little bit about our Few Forgotten Women project today. We will perhaps be using historical terms that are not considered to be acceptable any longer. This isn't because we're trying to offend anyone. It is because we might be quoting from contemporary documents where these words were used. And I think it's important that we don't brush over that and try and ignore that, because you can't change history, but we need to look at that in context. It's also, we're going to be talking about the misfortunate. So you might encounter stories of trauma and situations that may cause distress. I'm not sure that we've got anything too distressing in what we've picked today, but just in case, there's a bit of a warning. And as you were told, the sort of is a handout. When we were asked originally, we thought, well, we don't need to do a handout because everything you might need to know is on our Few Forgotten Women website. And then yesterday at the last minute, I decided you might like to have a nice list of some of the sources that I'm going to be talking about. But you'll get it. There's a link to that on the final slide to all the websites that you might need in order to get handouts and further information. Obviously, we are speaking to you from Britain, and so we will be looking at tracing women in Britain. If you don't have British ancestors, then hopefully there will be equivalent sources that you can look at in the countries of origin. So what makes women marginalised? Well, of course, to a large extent, we in the Western world live in a patriarchal society, and we still do. And women on the margins of society, sometimes purely because they're female. They don't necessarily have all the rights and responsibilities, shall we say, all the access to various education or professions that men might have had. Fortunately, things are improving, but certainly historically, it was definitely a man's world, and women are automatically put to one side to a certain extent. But some people are more marginalised than others, partly, I think, due to society's attitudes, but also perhaps to their own life choices or just to the force of circumstances. Why might we find out less about women than we do about men? Well, it's the men that make wills primarily. Certainly in Britain until 1882, a married woman had no property other than the clothes that she stood up in, would be extremely unlikely to make a will unless there'd been a marriage settlement allowing her to do so beforehand. It's the men who take out property leases, for example. It's the men who enter the professions. It's the men who are part of local government. So in all these variety of records, we're going to find men, often exclusively, but certainly in much greater numbers than we do women. But the women are there, they're hiding along the edges, really. And there are some sources where we actually might find more women, and we might look at some of those in a minute. We may well find women appearing, for example, in the newspapers, in court records. Certainly marginalised women often turn up in court records, for example. So we just need to be aware that there are places where we find women. We find women in workhouse records, in records relating to poor relief, because often it is women who fall into poverty more readily than men, particularly, for example, if a woman has been widowed. And what about particularly misfortunate women? And I think this is something that we at A Few Forgotten Women have become particularly interested in. Those women whose conditions or behaviours put them even further on the margins of society. The sort of thing that we're talking about is women who've been involved in the criminal justice system, for example, or those who were either illegitimate themselves or gave birth to an illegitimate child. Women in poverty, women suffering from mental illness. And in fact, that's another category of record where the number of women exceeds the number of men, and that's anything to do with asylum records, for example. Women who suffer from disabilities, perhaps women who found themselves caught up in prostitution, with women of certain ethnicities, because throughout history, different ethnicities have been stigmatized and there has been prejudice shown towards them. And then I'm going to add witchcraft on the end, because, of course, women in far greater numbers than men were accused of witchcraft. So I'm just going to, for my little part of the session, I'm going to look at those conditions in turn and run through a few sources that might help. This is a whistle-stop tour. It's to whet your appetite. It's to indicate that there are sources out there, and I put them all on the handout. And actually, each one of these could be a talk in itself. And then Margaret is going to talk a little bit, and Mandy, and finally, Margaret's got a case study for you. So let's think about criminality, first of all. What kind of records might you find if your female ancestor was involved in breaking the law in some way, or of being accused of breaking the law? Because the moral code for women was different to that for men. So perhaps something that men would maybe be laughed off, drunkenness, for example, was viewed very seriously if it was a woman, because women were the guardians of the next generation and they had a different moral code, different standards of behaviour were expected of women. So newspapers is a key resource, and often the first clue that a woman was in front of the courts will come up in a search on in the newspaper archives. Now, the British Newspaper Archive is a subscription site on its own, but those newspapers can also be accessed via a higher level of subscription to Find My Past, for example. There are still many newspapers that haven't been digitised and can't yet be searched, but the number that are available is very comprehensive, and it is increasing all the time. Then there are the court records themselves. Now, many of those are at the National Archives in London. A number of them are online, a significant number. There are other records held in our local archives. There's a website, a free website called Old Bailey Online, and that will give you access to indexed records of trials that were held at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey in London. So these tend to be more serious crimes, and you can freely search that website for the name of the accused, the name of the victim, the names of witnesses, and the names of the arresting officers. And that goes right back to the 17th century, so definitely worth a bit of a look there. Then there are a number of criminal records, as I say, predominantly at the National Archives. The National Archives, the English National Archives, have an excellent website, and on that website they have a number of research guides, and there are several that relate to different aspects of criminality. And a really good starting point is to download those free research guides from that particular website. One of the classes of record that you will find, and these are available both on Ancestry and on Find My Past, are the habitual criminals registers, which do what they say on the tin, really. They list those who've been before the courts on several occasions with some detail of the offences and the sentences and so on. Often there is a description, there is a list of aliases, and a number of the categories I'm mentioning, women have more than one name, just to confuse us when we're trying to trace them, of course. There are the records of the prisons themselves, again at the National Archives. Some of those are available on Find My Past, others are available on Ancestry. Only this morning I was looking at prison records for a particular prison in Dorset in the south of England, for example. And then there are calendars of prisoners, lists of those who've been tried at the assize courts. Those in original form are at the National Archives. They too are available on Ancestry. and on Find My Past. So as you can see, if a woman breaks the law or is accused of breaking the law, there's a number of places you can go to perhaps track her down. And in a number of cases, those will be free or will be part of a subscription to Ancestry or Find My Past, which you may well have access to in your library. What about illegitimacy then? Illegitimacy was a stigma until comparatively recently, both for the mother and for the child, not for the father. And that says it all, really. Now, there are a number of things that happened. Clearly, an illegitimate child or a mother of an illegitimate child is likely to have a problem supporting herself. So the powers that be, the overseers of the poor who were responsible for looking after these children, really wanted somebody else to pay. So the women underwent what was known as a bastardy examination. That is what it was called. It was set out in the bastardy legislation, and the woman would be hauled upon in front of the authorities, and she would be expected to name names. And these documents are single pieces of paper, normally. The problem with that is they don't survive awfully well. They're brilliant if they do, because often they will give you the name of a father of an illegitimate child that is gone from the records. These are mostly mid-18th century to, say, 1834, that kind of time period. And they are in local archives. There are a few of them coming online slowly. So I'm sorry, I'm introducing you to a class of record that it may be difficult for you to access, but I think it's important that you know about this. So maybe you know to ask and to send an email and say, is there anything for this particular area? And what you will find is that some parishes will have a lot of this kind of documentation, and others, sadly, the majority, will have nothing at all. But it's worth a try. Once the woman has named a name, there is a warrant drawn up for the gentleman's apprehension, and then he has to sign a bond agreeing to pay to support that child. Of course, the parish registers of baptism often give us clues about illegitimacy, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, there will be hints to the father's name, if only by the mother giving the child a middle name that is clearly somebody's surname. There are court records. Occasionally a woman would attempt to get the father to pay. There'll be affiliation orders drawn up, so you might find something there. And again, the newspapers will report those too. For more recent illegitimacies, of course, sometimes a DNA test will give us the hint that we need to where we need to go to look for those missing fathers. But I don't think we can underestimate just how much society would have stigmatized these women. And as I say, many of these women would also be women in poverty. And these categories that I'm talking about do intersect. A single woman might break the law, be in poverty, have an illegitimate child. So you'll find that many women fall under more than one of these categories. What can you do if your ancestors were poor? And I say many of them are women. And I think the important thing to remember here is the date 1834, which is when the care of the poor in England and Wales changed. Previously to 1834, it was the responsibility of the home parish of the individual pauper. After 1834, there was a more comprehensive, cohesive system of workhouses which covered a much larger area, huge institutions. And so the records before and after 1834 will be slightly different. The vast majority of these will be in local county archives. Some are online, not as many as we would like, but this is something that is increasing. So what might you find? Well, prior to 1834, you will find the records of the overseers of the poor. And they include, sorry, I shouldn't have gone that far yet, they include account books. So they will be collecting money in from the more wealthy citizens and then supporting the paupers using that money. Money doesn't tend to get given to the paupers, heaven forbid. They might spend it on loose living and gin and so on. they will be given food or fuel or medicines or clothing instead. What are settlement records? Well, because the whole of this system relied on the parish looking after its own, there had to be a system whereby you decided which people were your own, who belonged to which parish. And the settlement legislation in the middle of the 17th century set this out quite neatly. The default is wherever you're born is your parish of settlement, but you might do something during your life to change that. You might get married if you were a woman, and then automatically you take the parish of settlement of your husband, even if that's a place that you've never been to. If you have a steady job for more than a year, if you rent a property worth over £10 a year or more, if you serve as a parish official or complete an apprenticeship, all those could potentially change your parish of settlement. So when somebody looked like they needed help from the overseers of the poor, there would often be a settlement examination. A settlement examination would ask questions about where you were born. Have you rented a house? Who have you worked for? And then they could decide which parish you belong to. If you weren't in the right place, they would draw up something called a removal order, which would be instructing the parish constable to take you back to your parish settlement to be looked after. Parish apprentice records, the best way of getting somebody off the poor law books is, well, the second best way, I suppose, is to apprentice them. And parish apprenticeships were very, very different from the traditional trade-based apprentices. These were citizens of the parish, more wealthy citizens, were forced to take these apprentices. There was no choice. They could be children as young as 3, and they were apprenticed to vague trades like housewifery or husbandry. And you will also get girls, which is much rarer in more traditional apprenticeship records. No checks were made on their welfare. So you can see it was a system that was open to all sorts of abuse. But there are details of these apprentices and where they were sent. These too in your local record offices. There were private charities that set out to help the poor, and having said apprenticing them was the second best way of keeping the poor rates low, the best way is to send them overseas, as far away as possible, and hope they don't come back. So there were government immigration schemes in the 19th century and into the 20th century that would send children, and you'll almost certainly be aware of the home children who predominantly went to Canada, for example. And these sending aways, these transportations effectively of poor children were recorded, and most of those records are going to be at the National Archives or in the records of private charities. After 1834, the workhouse system comes into place, and the workhouses would deal with a much wider area, but similar sorts of records, looking at who was being entered into the workhouse and who was being apprenticed and so on. The place to start for British workhouses is a website run by a gentleman called Peter Higginbotham, workhouses.com, because that will tell you all sorts of background information. It will give you links to where you can find records as well. Although I suspect men suffered from mental ill health as much as women, it's the women who end up in asylums in greater numbers. And there are all sorts of records that result from that. There are both county asylum records, because from 1808, each county was supposed to build its own asylum. And there are private asylums as well. There are also records for the National Asylum, which was in South London, but took people from across the country. Many of those records for the National Asylum, Bethlehem Hospital, are at the National Archives and are also online. They're available at Find My Past. They also have an excellent museum. There are lunacy patient admission records at the National Archives and on Ancestry. They deal with those who were deemed to need help from an asylum, and they will tell you where each particular individual was sent, and often you can see people being transferred from one asylum to another. They're very short entries, but they are helpful for telling you where somebody might be. Those who had committed a crime but were deemed to have a mental health problem were dealt with slightly differently. So there are criminal lunacy warrant and entry books at the National Archives available and searchable on Ancestry. And then there are the actual asylum registers themselves, which can give you really detailed case histories and often a photograph. And that's something that perhaps, along with the prison records, although I didn't say it at that point, something that we perhaps don't normally get. We don't normally get an image of the people at this level of society. The marginalised are often not photographed. Disability too has its place to play in marginalising individuals. And again, we find records of the disabled both in the asylums, because the mentally disabled and the mentally ill were often treated as if they were the same, and also, of course, in the workhouse. There are hospital records. Some of those are available online. There are the workhouse records is another place to look. And of course, census records, and certainly from 1851, certain kinds of disability were recorded in a column of the census. I mentioned prostitution, and clearly there are male as well as female prostitutes, but predominantly, of course, it is women. And a woman would be very unlikely to identify herself as a prostitute. It does happen, but it's unlikely. But once she is in the grips of an institution or an authority, then that's where that designation will come. And sometimes they will be labelled as such in a census, for example, particularly if they're in prison or in a workhouse. There are instances of women being referred to as prostitutes in parish registers. That's quite rare, but they do turn up. They're definitely referred to in workhouse registers. Sometimes that's the reason that they're in the workhouse. And also in asylum records, there was a concept of something called moral insanity, whereby any kind of sexual misdemeanor was seen as a sign of insanity. Should also say that the label prostitute was used differently historically to the way it is today. It could just refer to a woman who had had a sexual relationship outside of marriage. There are court records of prosecutions, of course, and the prison records that result from that, and of course newspaper reports of those trials. A word about ethnicity, and this refers to a whole range of ethnicities who have at various times in history been vilified and stigmatized. And it's, I guess, anyone not like us. And this doesn't just refer, though there's an image there that relates to slavery, this doesn't just refer to slavery, it refers to the Romanian traveller population, for example. But as you're no doubt aware, there are slave registers that are available online at Ancestry. There is also a website called the Legacy of British Slave Ownership, which lists all those enslavers who were compensated for the loss of their workforce when slavery was officially ended in Britain in 1832. It was taking of new slaves was abolished much sooner, but you were allowed to keep the ones that you had already got. So the actual ending of the system was a little bit later, but that's freely available online. If you're interested in the Romanian traveller population, then a good place to start is the Family History Society that specialises in that. And I just want to lastly look at witchcraft, because, as I say, women are far more likely to be accused of witchcraft than men. And so you might get broadsheets, the newspapers of the day, the popular press of the day, which tell stories of witchcraft trials, often not terribly accurately, I must say. Again, there are court records. Oops, that's Margaret's bit. And put some links on the handout to all sorts of sources and websites that can take you further. I am now going to hand to Margaret, who is just going to talk you through the ethics of telling some of these stories.
Okay, thank you, Janet. So as Janet said, I want to talk about something close to the heart of family historians. And no matter whether we are professionals, curious hobbyists, or a family member who just got roped in, and that is ethics or moral dilemmas, if you like. Now, I know that might all sound a bit daunting, but really, it's just about doing right by the people whose stories we're uncovering, whether they'd lived centuries ago or whether they're still alive today. And my plan for this part of this afternoon is to offer you some thoughts on what you need to consider ethically when carrying out your family history research. Now, as family historians, we have an amazing job. We are the ones piecing together the puzzle of where we come from. We get to unearth incredible stories, uncover hidden connections, and sometimes even solve a mystery or two. But with all that comes responsibility. Canals, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in 2009 stated that moral dilemmas are situations where you have to weigh two or more moral duties, but you can only honour one, meaning you're bound to go against one important value no matter what. And for us then, this often boils down to discovering something unexpected about your family and deciding what to do with it. On one hand, we're driven by curiosity and the desire to share what we find, whether that's adding it to the family tree, sharing it with relatives, or even publishing it. But then there's the flip side. Asking too many questions or making something public can often lead to hurt feelings, awkward conversations, or even a family drama. For professional genealogists, it's a little different. They are trained to handle surprises and often warn clients that digging up the past can sometimes uncover things that are shocking or upsetting. But even they face ethical challenges, like how to share sensitive information or deal with family myths without causing unnecessary pain. In our research, we often find ourselves wrestling with some very tricky questions. Should we spill the beans on long hidden family secrets, or set the record straight on those cherished family stories, or debunk the myths that don't quite match the evidence? How do we share our findings without stepping on the toes of living relatives who might prefer to keep certain things private? Then there's the big stuff, like whether past wrongs, what some people like to call the sins of the fathers, deserve some kind of restitution. And if so, how on earth would we go about that? And let's not forget temptation to put a shiny gloss on the past. How much romanticising or whitewashing is okay before we're no longer telling the real story? So when we dig into old records, letters, or even family folklore, it's tempting to paint the past in a way that fits a neat, inspiring narrative. But our job isn't to rewrite history, it's to tell it like it is. That means being truthful, even when the truth is awkward or uncomfortable. After all, it's those complexities that make our ancestors real. It makes them relatable, and it makes them intriguing. We have to consider the question, why do some families keep secrets or cling to myths, even when there's evidence to the contrary? And often it's about protecting reputations, whether that's an individual's, a family's, or even a nation's. For example, think about the stigma around unmarried pregnant women in earlier times, or the way some nations have tried to gloss over injustices towards indigenous populations or wartime atrocities. These secrets can shape how we view history and challenge long-term beliefs. And let's not forget how attitudes change over time. What was once considered shameful, like perhaps having a convict ancestor or being an unmarried mother isn't a big deal anymore. But that doesn't mean everyone is ready to have those stories aired, especially if they've kept them private for years. Of course, not all secrets can be reframed in a positive light. Some stories, like those connected to slavery or war crimes, remain deeply troubling. And in these cases, the ethical challenge is even greater. How do we handle these truths with honesty and sensitivity? These are the kind of dramas and dilemmas that keep family historians and researchers on their toes. Then there's the question of privacy. Sometimes what we uncover isn't just about the past, it's about people who are still alive. Maybe you've stumbled across a family secret or found a long-lost relative. Exciting, certainly, but we've got to tread carefully. Just because we've found something doesn't mean it's ours to share. Respecting people's feelings and boundaries is key. And the general rule of thumb, or golden rule, is if you're in any doubt, ask. And related to the privacy question are legal ones too. Genealogists and family historians, especially hobbyists, might not always realise there are laws about privacy, copyright, slander, and even harassment that apply to their research. Professionals, guided by codes of practice, are sometimes more aware, but anyone sharing their findings publicly should take time to learn the rules. For instance, did you know in some countries like Germany, the dignity of a person is protected even after their death? It's a fascinating but tricky area to navigate. And another big one is inclusivity. Family history isn't just about the big names or the well-documented folks. It's about everyone. We need to make space for stories that might have been overlooked. As you found out, a speciality of us here at A Few Forgotten Women, we research those female voices that weren't always heard in the records. And by doing this, we don't just respect our ancestors, we enrich our understanding of who we are as a family, as a community, and as a society. We put our ancestors' lives into the context of the time, as well as into a place and space. And that sometimes helps us understand why our forebears made the choices they made, or whether they even had a choice at all. And this is especially true of females across time, as Janet has just been explaining. But we also here need to reflect on our own intuitions. It's very easy as modern researchers to jump to conclusions based on our 21st century ideas about gender, equality, and fairness. For instance, our first instinct might be to view examples of how women, especially poor, working class women, were disadvantaged, oppressed, discriminated against, and limited by their circumstances. The ethical dilemma here is, can we really understand their lives through the lens of our modern beliefs? It's sometimes tempting to assume women were just swept along by the natural consequences of a male patriarchal society. But sometimes women did call the shots, often driven by faith or practical needs. So we need to remind ourselves to think carefully about how we approach the past, and that although our modern perspectives can offer valuable insights, they can also make us oversimplify or misunderstand the choices and values of our ancestors, who after all lived in very different times. And let's not forget about the living. When we're digging up the past, it's easy to get caught up in the thrill of discovery. But it's just as important to involve the people around us, our relatives, the communities connected to our research, and anyone who might be affected by what we find. Their insight can add depth to our work, and their feelings deserve both our appreciation and acknowledgement. But of course, with the living, we can also find ourselves dipping our toes into the minefield that is genetic genealogy or DNA testing. DNA testing is like, well, shining a super-powered flashlight into the dusty corners of your family history, uncovering all sorts of surprises. Not all welcome, it has to be said. But while it's amazing for solving mysteries, it comes with some big ethical questions. DNA testing can reveal things people once tried very hard to hide, like adoptions no one talked about, infidelity, or even cases of misattributed parentage, such as when someone long believed to be a parent or grandparent has no biological relationship to the child or grandchild at all. And sure, traditional genealogy research can uncover these kinds of secrets too, but DNA testing has a way of cutting through the paper trail and exposing the truth in a way that feels almost effortless. That's where the ethical challenges come. What does the tester need to know before they spit into that tube? The three main things to remember are that testing should only happen with informed consent from the person being tested. Everyone needs to understand that DNA testing can reveal unexpected information, and results shouldn't be shared without explicit permission from the person tested. Christine Kennelly has a great way of putting it. DNA testing can feel like opening Pandora's box. You don't know what's going to come out, and sometimes it's distressing. But she also found that for every difficult story, there are just as many tales of positive discovery and willingness to embrace the messy, complicated truth of the past. And the distress doesn't come from the DNA test itself. It comes from the secrets people tried to keep hidden. When handled with care, DNA testing is just another tool in the genealogist toolkit, one that can illuminate the past in incredible ways. As long as we respect people's privacy, seek informed consent, and share results responsibly, there's no reason not to embrace it. After all, family history is all about discovery, even if some of those discoveries are more surprising than others. At the end of the day, then, family history isn't just about uncovering names and dates. It's about navigating successfully the deeply human stories that come with those names and dates. Think of it as a privilege intertwined with a responsibility. We are the keepers of stories, the bridge between the past and the future, and it's an incredible role, but it comes with a lot of responsibility. So let's try and approach it with sensitivity, kindness, loyalty, integrity, respect, empathy, and of course, a good dose of humility. Because when we get it right, it's not just about telling stories, we're celebrating lives, and that is truly something special. And now I'd like to hand over to Mandy, who's going to talk to us about our work as Few Forgotten Women.
Thanks very much, Margaret. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our Few Forgotten Women project. As Janet explained earlier, even without meaning to, family historians often focus on the men on our family tree due to their prominence in documentary records. Merely by virtue of her gender, a female can become overlooked. The A Few Forgotten Women project seeks to preserve the memory of just some of these marginalised women whose stories might otherwise be lost. Our team's expertise lies in British records, so that is the focus of our stories, and we plan to spread our geographical range across the British Isles as our project progresses. The team behind the A Few Forgotten Women project are a group of friends who call themselves collectively A Few Good Women, a pun on Janet's name. We first got together during lockdown to provide mutual encouragement for family history projects, but soon realised that unless we took on the responsibility of recording them, the stories of many of the women we encountered during our research would be lost. So A Few Forgotten Women was born with the aim of the project to preserve the memory of some women who have until now been hiding in the shadows, forgotten by history. As part of our project, we hold collaborative research days online, which we call Forgotten Women Fridays, where we select and research an institution and are joined by volunteers to research the individual women found in these institutions. The majority of the stories on our website are a result of our Forgotten Women Fridays, although there are also some stories contributed by guests. Since we began, we have researched women and girls from various institutions such as ragged or industrial schools, inebriate women's homes, teacher training college, a school of housewifery, a children's hospital, where we research both trainee nurses and patients, and two very different schools for the deaf, one of which was the first free school for deaf children in the UK, which opened in 1792, and just recently, homes for fallen women. We have researched their stories using many of the records mentioned by Janet earlier, and these are either available online or in archives. Our volunteers have also made great use of Janet's suggestions of newspapers in order to add extra context to the stories. These were especially useful for the inebriate women who were often appearing in court multiple times, resulting in plenty of newspaper coverage. Our upcoming events involve researching the women working in the Clark's shoe factory for International Women's Day in March. The Clarks are a well-known Quaker family. Our next Forgotten Women Friday is going to be researching some of the female inmates of Dorchester Prison. So we're looking forward to that one quite avidly. Anyway, I hope that gives you just a very brief outline of our project and our work. Thank you very much, and I believe Margaret is going to talk next.
As we've heard, the Few Forgotten Women team celebrate the experiences of marginalised females by recovering and making visible the lives of those often hidden from history, whether because of disadvantages related to inequalities of gender or class. But due to the very nature of these lives, it can be very difficult to find details in official records. However, what follows goes to prove that even women who live their lives in the public arena can often confound our best efforts to find them at various stages of their life. So on the screen, as you can see, is Agnes Alice Beckwith. Now, Agnes wasn't marginalised or hidden by any stretch of the imagination. And for many years, her every move was tracked by journalists. She was almost the Taylor Swift of her day. And Agnes has occupied a considerable amount of my research time over the course of the last 20-odd years. And even though I'm considered to be the leading expert, having written her biography and numerous papers on her and the Beckwith family, there are still features of her life that elude me, as you will discover. Agnes was born on the 24th of August, 1861, in Lambeth, South London. She was the second daughter of leading swimming professor and entrepreneur Fred Beckwith and his wife, Agnes. Although swimming in her father's exhibition since she was 4, she came into the public gaze after swimming 5 miles in the Thames, aged 15, in September 1875. And from then on, she followed a career as a natationist, exhibiting in the UK, Europe, and North America. And a lot of her exploits are very easy to track through the newspapers. But this afternoon, we're going to do the family history thing and track her through the census. Now, being born in August 1861 means that the 1871 census on the top there is the time that she made her first appearance. And here she is, as you can see, with her brothers Fred, Willie, and Charlie. By 1881, the next census on the bottom of the slide, her mother had died and her 2 elder brothers had married. So she's just there, as you can see, with her father Fred, Agnes, and her younger brother Charlie. On the 4th of May, 1882, by which time Agnes was a huge name in the Victorian sporting world, she marries her business manager and theatrical agent, William Taylor. Note, despite being really well known and a swimmer across the world, she has no occupation by her name on her marriage certificate. Then we come to 1891, and all seems well. Here we've got William and Agnes with Clara Abdale. She was a lifelong friend of Agnes and a member of the Beckwith swimming troupe. Agnes carries on using the Beckwith name for all her engagements. And if we scroll on another 10 years to 1901, Agnes, now in her 30s, although as you can see, she's taken a year off her age here, saying she's 37 when she's actually 38. She's still performing, and alongside William and the ever-present Clara, in the census living with them is also Maud, who was another swimmer, and Joseph Fuller, a theatrical friend of William's. In 1903, Agnes gives birth to a son, who the couple called William Walter Beckwith Taylor. Then we move on to 1911, and we're still doing really well. Agnes, at the age of 48, is living in Hemel Hempstead, North London, along with 8-year-old Willie and Clara, while husband William is visiting his sister on the other side of London in Battersea. Now you'll notice on the occupation here that Agnes and Clara both state in the column that they're actually doing nothing, but they have been professional swimmers. So that just shows how important it was to them that although they're actually not employed now, they wanted to make the note that they have been professional swimmer in the past. But it's from here that things started to get a little difficult. Now that she had retired, mentions of Agnes disappeared from the newspapers. Now, at this stage of my research, the 1921 census hadn't been released, and there was no sign of Agnes on the 1939 National Register. I couldn't find a death for her, and nothing related to her son. I spent many an hour, well, days, okay, weeks if truth be known, trying to find a death or a mention of Agnes. And I thought, with her being a famous sportswoman, that some mention of her death may have been found in the newspapers, but there was nothing. And there was no mention of William or his theatrical agency either. It was almost as if the whole Taylor family had just disappeared off the face of the earth. And what follows in the next few minutes actually represents over 20 years of research. So then I decided that I might look at Clara Abdale. She was, as I said, a lifelong friend of Agnes's, and perhaps there would be a clue there. But at first there was nothing. And it wasn't until the electoral registers for the 1920s and 30s were digitised, and then I found a big clue. Clara was living in the Streatham area of London in the same house as an Agnes Beckwith Saunders and a Leopold Beckwith Saunders. I wondered if that was some sort of coincidence. So I started to search for a marriage of Agnes Taylor to a Leopold Saunders and came up with nothing, which I thought was a bit strange. But then perhaps they weren't married, which is often the case. Couples say they were married when they actually weren't. But Clara married. So I decided to send off for her marriage certificate. And here it is. On the 16th of September, at the age of 61, a widower, Philip Ernest Aller. But it's one of the witnesses that catches my eye on the bottom here, Jack B. Saunders. Does the B stand for Beckwith? I wondered. So back down the rabbit hole I go, and I search around until I find the death of Leopold Beckwith Saunders on the 20th of November 1941, age 61. And the informant is his widow, A. B. Saunders. You just see that there in the what we call the informant part of the death certificate. I also found mention of Leopold in the Masonic registers of the early 1920s in Westcliff-on-Sea, some 50 miles from central London. Leopold was a travelling consulting optician and travelled around the country a lot. So my next stop was back to the 1939 register. If the A.B. Saunders on this death certificate was Agnes, then the couple should appear on that at least. Again, I could find nothing. So back to the drawing board. In 1939, according to the electoral registers, Leopold, Agnes and Clara were living at 315 Latham Court, Norwood, South London, which is a very similar address to this death certificate for Leopold. So I tried an address search on the 1939 register, and I found Jack B. Saunders and presumably his wife Mabel with 3 redacted names, possibly their children. So I start getting a little bit excited. I might be getting closer. However, I can't find a marriage of a Jack B. Saunders to anyone called Mabel anywhere in the country. So perhaps I'm just as far away from finding the truth as I ever was. So I scratched my head. Where am I going to go next? I know, wills. Did Leopold leave a will? He was a businessman. You'd think he'd have his head screwed on. He would have made a will, surely he would. And yes, he did. And that proved to be that little bit of thread that you pull on that unravels the rest of the story. It's still quite complicated, so you'll need to stick with me. Firstly, the entry from the probate calendar, which was another good clue here for me. His widow has her full name mentioned, Agnes Alice Beckwith Saunders, and a Jack Beckwith Saunders, who I suspect is probably his son. And I send off for the will, but I have to wait for it to be posted. No such luxury as an email version at that time. And while I'm waiting, I try and find a marriage of Agnes again, or a birth for Jack, or in fact any site of both Leopold and Agnes in the 1939 register. But I'm still coming up with nothing, no matter how many spelling variations I try. And again, the 1921 census was still a long way from being released at this time, so I'm getting no help there either. But I still remember the morning that I opened the letter that contained this, Leopold's will, which, as you can see, says that he was formerly called Leopold Solomon, and that Jack Beckwith Saunders was his stepson. Leopold leaves everything to his dear wife Agnes, or Jack in the event that she predeceases him. But the cherry on the cake here being that Clara Aller, née Abdale, was witness, which ties all these people nicely together. But note it is the licensee of the Sun Inn in Bridport, Dorset. So from this information, I tracked down the marriage of Agnes and Leopold Solomon, not Sanders. No wonder I couldn't find it. And a few surprises here. The 2nd of August 1916, where Agnes claims to be a widow and just 37 years old. I don't think so, Agnes. You were born in 1861, which even by my rubbish maths makes you at least 55. Leopold was 20 years younger, so maybe there'd been a bit of a slip up with the registrar. So let's give Agnes the benefit of the doubt. Just husband William, anywhere to be found. But this marriage takes place in Exeter, 180 miles from her last known address in the London area. And I did start to speculate as to whether she'd committed bigamy and hoped not to be caught. But as you may notice, one of the witnesses to the marriage here at the bottom is her son, William, who was only 13 at the time. It's unlikely that he would have been party to his mother's marriage if he had suspected that his father was still alive. And by the way, there's still no trace of her second son, Jack. I can't find a birth record for him anywhere. Jack, however, has been a busy bee. He runs the Sun Inn in Bridport, he breeds dogs and ponies, and is frequently mentioned in local newspapers. The couple had 2 children, Jacqueline and William, and they tracked them down, living in New Zealand, and blissfully unaware of their grandmother's fame. They knew something of her life, but nothing much. But they did send me this, their father's death certificate. November 1954, in South Africa. So when did he go to South Africa? But the thing that jumped out at me was his date of birth, the 19th of February, 1903. That rang a bell. It's the same date as Agnes's son, William. Remember me showing you this earlier? Born on the same day, but they weren't twins. The National Archives solved the problem for me. In 1938, William Walter Charles Beckwith Taylor, I've no idea when he added the Charles to his name, changed his name by default to Jack Beckwith Saunders. So they're not 2 sons at all. Jack and William are one and the same person. No wonder I could never find anything birth-related for Jack. Now, this newspaper snippet from August 1948 is a notification of an upcoming auction at the Sun Inn Bridport. All of the furniture and household effects of a Mr. J. Saunders, due to him going abroad. And alongside that, there's an image from the family of a young Jack and Mabel with Mabel's nieces and nephews. So obviously, passenger manifests were my next call. And surprise, surprise, he should be emigrating to South Africa with Jack and his family, but none other than Mrs. A. Saunders, Agnes, at the age of 88, off on another adventure. So, oh well, I thought, Agnes has moved to South Africa and it's really difficult to get records from there. So I'd got no hope of tracing her death. But I was actually in luck. A tentative email to the Roots Web mailing list caught the attention of a South African researcher in Port Elizabeth, who discovered for me that Agnes had died, aged 90, on the 10th of July 1951 in a Nazarene home for the elderly. Her ashes were added to the communal grave and her name engraved on the headstone. So Agnes' story was almost complete. She should have been on the 1939 register somewhere, and I still had to wait a while for the 1921 census to be released. But remember her age discrepancy at her second marriage? Well, this is where I stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt at all. I wrote to find my path, explained the situation, and wondered if therefore they could find her on the register. And success. She actually turned out to be one of the three redactions with Jack and Mabel. And here's the updated version. And you just may be able to make it out, but I've blown it up for you a bit on the bottom. She claims to have been born in 1870, 24th of August there, 1870. And just above it, it's been officially corrected to 1860. Still not quite right, but only a year out rather than the 9 years that Agnes was trying to get away with. And it just goes to show you that the 1939 National Register birth dates aren't always correct. So then, the story of Agnes is an example of not giving up when the going gets tough, and how researching your family ancestors often involves shifting your focus and looking at other records. Our female ancestors may not have created many of their own records, but someone else may well provide you with the facts about her life, and that someone most likely will be male, but they also might be her children, her friends, or other relations. And what you need to do is to make sure that you have properly interpreted every possible detail. Sometimes it's less about finding a direct connection and more about learning how to discover and put clues together to draw the correct conclusion. Oh yes, and I nearly forgot, the 1921 census. A triumph for Agnes, who manages, as you might just be able to make out on the top line, to take 20 years off her age, claiming to be 40 rather than 60. So all I can say is, whatever Agnes was taking to fool everybody, I definitely want some of that. We hope you've enjoyed listening to our Few Forgotten Women presentation this afternoon. Thank you for listening, and we're now happy to take any questions.
This was actually a question for Margaret, and Jessica was wondering, with ethics, what would be a good way to proceed with a sensitive topic when the person you're assisting with research, they want to know the sensitive information, but other people in the family don't want anything to do with it. They also don't agree with what's been discovered. So what are your suggestions?
It's compromise, isn't it, with that one, I think. I don't know whether Janet or Mandy, please come in with your thoughts. So I think you need, it is a compromise. You need to talk to all the parties and try and work out a way, negotiate a way through it, I think is the best. Sounds a bit loose and woolly, but I think that's the best way to tackle that one. Any thoughts, Janet or Mandy, on that?
No, I agree completely.
Yeah.
I think it has to be handled sensitively, and you can't just run roughshod over everyone else's feelings because one person wants to know answers. You do have to think carefully about things. So great advice.
Do you have anything to add, Janet?
No, I think that's absolutely the case. It's very difficult. We have to remember that they may be our relatives, but sometimes they're somebody else's relatives as well. And those somebody else's may feel differently about having great granny's time in prison or an asylum or whatever splashed all over wherever.
Yeah.
Margaret, are you able to put the last slide up again? I have put all the links from the last slide in the chat, so that might be an easier way for people to access that. It's not sharing, Margaret. I don't know why. Oh, there you are. That's it.
No,
there it is. No, it is now.
Okay. I think it's my internet is a little bit slow, I think.
Okay. The last question that I am seeing here is, how can one get a record open when it's previously been officially closed?
Mandy's typing an answer, so I'll let her do that. but you're on mute, Mandy.
Well, okay, if you want me to speak rather than type. Yeah, I have personally can think of a couple of instances. I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the National Archives to release a document to me, which was very painless. I thought it was going to be tied up in bureaucracy, but it wasn't. It was very quick and easy. It got quite a decent turnaround in terms of time. And I've also, a number of times, I have provided copies of death certificates to find my past or ancestry, for them to update their 1939 register to show that someone is deceased and they should no longer be redacted. And that again, that can sometimes take a little while because each of the companies have their own respective time limits for, or calendar, I should say, for when they update and release their new redactions. So, but bear with it; it's worth doing. So if you know that one of your ancestors is going to be there, and they're deceased, and you can't wait to see that record, by all means submit your request to them. They have details on both their websites, different process for each, and eventually you will get there.
Janet, quick thing. I just noticed that when you were putting those links in the chat, you sent it to just the hosts and panelists.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Just stick it in there one more time
I can do
and
that.
everyone will have it.
If I can just add to Mandy's, with Agnes, the story I've just told you about, she obviously died in South Africa. So there isn't a British birth certificate, a death certificate, sorry. But because of the time difference, and I explained the story, I didn't need to provide any additional information except her birth certificate that showed she was born and a copy of her marriage certificate to, I think it was Find My Past. And they just worked it out for themselves that obviously by now she would have been dead because she was born in 1861. So they redacted that, unredacted that in the next time that they did an update.
So thank you all three of you for joining us and for such a great presentation. Super fascinating, and honestly, we should all be digging into those forgotten women, because I feel like everyone has at least one in the tree. So thank you for giving us some inspiration and some good ideas. Final thing before we end, just as another reminder, I know I sound like a broken record. If you'd like a copy of the chat, please send us an email. It's genealogy@acpl.info. It's in the chat. Okay, so do any of you have anything else to say before we wrap up for the day?
No, just thank you for asking us to come and share what we spend most of our lives doing, I think.
Yeah.
Yes,
We'd
thank
love
you very
to
much.
we'd love to see some of you join us on a Few Forgotten Friday if you'd like to join us in researching.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. I hope the weather gets better in the UK for all of you soon. All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Okay,
Bye.
all right. Thank you. Good night, everybody. Bye.
All right.